Hey everyone, Pastor BJ here coming to you from Kirkmont Church. This past Sunday, we kicked off Advent 2020, and I have to say this is without question one of my favorite seasons of the year. Now, part of the reason I enjoy this so much is because it is a jolly festive time. I get to spend time with family and friends, and I get to eat a lot of food and drink a lot of eggnog and slurp down a whole bunch of candy canes. So it's just a good time for me in general. But it's also a time of the year when I get a lot of questions about why we celebrate Christmas, how to celebrate Christmas. What is the most God-honoring way to address this season? And so what I thought I might do over the next 4 weeks leading up to Christmas to address a different issue each week related to Advent. And this week, we want to look at the question of why do we celebrate Christmas on December 25th? So it may come as a surprise to some of you that we don't actually know what time of the year Jesus was born. We don't know what his birth date is. The New Testament really only talks about his birth in two places, the book of Matthew and the book of Luke. And though they are filled with huge numbers of details, none of those details indicate to us what the calendar time was. We don't know what date Jesus was born. But it does raise the question then, well, why do we celebrate on December 25th? What is the reason behind that? And there are sort of two working theories, and I'll share both of them with you, and I'll tell you where I land on this discussion. The first one is basically the pagan midwinter celebration theory. The thinking behind this is that Christianity really began to blossom in pagan Rome. And at the time when Christianity was growing, there was a widespread practice known as Saturnalia. And this was a midwinter festival where they would worship the god Saturn. It began on December 17th, and it would last, in some cases, 3 days, other cases up to 7 days, which leads us roughly up to the December 25th date. Now, if you take a look, broadly speaking, at some of the things that they did during Saturnalia, they resemble some of the things that we do in our Christmas holiday now. They would hang up all sorts of greenery and lights, and they would bring trees into their house, and they would always go and practice, or they would go out with this practice of singing songs in the streets, which, roughly resembles our singing Christmas carols. The one big difference, though, is that they were normally drunk and naked, and that is a practice I'm glad that we gave up, so for many reasons. So and the theory kind of looks a little bit like this, that as Christianity became the more dominant religion, there were these powerful church leaders who sought to snuff out the pagan practices of Rome and were unable to do so. And so rather than trying to continue to fight the good fight against paganism and pushing Christianity, they decided to co-opt a very popular holiday. So December 25th, rather than it being a practice of Saturnalia, they decided to make this Christmas. Instead of us worshiping Saturn, we're now going to worship Jesus. Now there's a little variation of this as well. In the 200s AD, one of the emperors decided that he wanted to make December 25th, the midwinter holiday, a time to celebrate Sol Invictus. Now, this was a sun god that Rome had imported, and the idea here is that in the midwinter, the winter solstice, days have been getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and somewhere about the midwinter, they start getting longer and longer and longer. It's the unconquered sun, and the sun begins to win the battle over darkness, and the days begin to get longer and longer. So, according to this version of the pagan origins theory, they decided to just take Sol Invictus out and put Jesus in. They'll point to a few pictures of Jesus where they roughly resemble some of the pictures of Sol Invictus as well. But the idea here is that the early church leaders basically just co-opted a pagan practice and turned it into a Christian one. So I think you can see here that there's some truth behind some of this. There is some similarities in practices, there are some similarities in time frames, and so you can see that there's sort of a general plausibility here. But I'm not convinced that this stands up to scrutiny. I held this position for a while. I kind of assumed that was to be the case, but after you take the time to really study the history of the church, you realize that this really just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. In many ways, the early church sought to differentiate themselves from the pagans. They weren't trying to mimic the pagans. They were doing everything they could to be as unpagan as possible. So the idea that they would just flip on a dime and start all of a sudden practicing, this type of syncretism, this mixing of different religions, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The other problem I have with the theory is that it gives the early Christians way too much power. I mean, it's painted as if all of these powerful bishops were going around telling the Roman Empire how to practice their holidays. And the fact of the matter is, they just did not have that much power. By the time you get to the year 300 or 400, you see the widespread practice of Christmas. But even then, you don't have church leaders that have the ability to just say, here's what we're going to do. They were still very much growing in influence, but they were not that powerful when it came to the ability to tell people what to do. So that doesn't really hold up to scrutiny either. But here's the biggest flaw, I think, in that particular theory. The church leaders left us huge numbers of records. Like, we can read what they were talking about. They left us transcripts of their conversations, their debates, their discussions. And guess how much of it they discussed worrying about people practicing Saturnalia? 0. Guess how much they thought to themselves, you know what, maybe we should try to co-opt this holiday? Not at all. There's not a single conversation recorded anywhere where there's this nefarious bishop going, ha ha ha, we can take over Saturnalia, or we can replace Sol Invictus with Jesus. None of that exists. What you actually see happening here is that the early church was influenced far less by paganism, but far more by Judaism. And when you look at the actual records of the early conversations about the practice of Christmas, what you see is an obsessive look at the calendar for when Jesus was born, because they wanted to make sure that they lined it up with when Jesus died. So here was the Jewish thinking that influenced this conversation. You can look at the records of the New Testament, and you can pretty closely pinpoint the date when Jesus died. And the early Jewish records put them into what, according to the Jewish calendar, would be the 14th day of Nisan. Not the car company, but the Jewish month Nisan. And when you convert that from the Jewish calendar over into our Western calendar now, you get March 25th. Now, transferring it from the Jewish calendar into the Western calendar is not an exact science. And so there were some people who were saying, no, actually it's not March 25th, it's April 6th. And so, you get this sort of debate going on about whether it was this date or this date. BJ, what does this have to do with Christmas? You're talking about Easter at this point. Here's what it has to do. There was a widespread belief among Jewish thinkers at the time that influenced the early church that said this, basically. Important people who were ordained of God to do things, like Jesus would have been, always died the same day that they were born. Now, I'm not sure where that thinking comes from, but it is written down. That was their logic that they were using. Now, some of you may be saying, but BJ, we don't practice Christmas on March 25th. Where does this idea come from? Well, so what would happen is, in Jewish thought, you come into the world the day that you're conceived, not the day that you actually are given birth to by your mother. So you would take March 25th or April 6th, and you rewind the clock 9 months. And for those of you who are good at math, if you rewind the clock back 9 months from March 25th, you get December 25th. Likewise, if you rewind the clock back 9 months from April 6th, you get January 6th. And here's the final piece of evidence that makes me think that the pagan origins theory had little to do with it. Many parts of the Christian world practiced Christmas not on December 25th, but on January 6th. In the western part of the continent, that's where they practiced December 25th Christmas. But on the eastern side, they practiced it on January 6th. So if they were just mimicking a Roman holiday, there would be nobody practicing on January 6th. And yet, there were numbers of people that were doing that. In fact, even today, there are portions of the Eastern Orthodox Church where they practice Christmas, they celebrate Christmas on January 6th. And as a quick side note, for those of you that may be wondering, the difference between December 25th and January 6th is where we get our 12 days of Christmas. Just a fun little side note there. So now, here's the final conclusion that I want to make from all of this. It really, honestly, whichever one you are most convinced of, I'm less concerned with, although I do believe that it was the Jewish influence that landed on that date. But here's the point that I think is important. Far too often, those of us, particularly in the Protestant church, are very quick to dismiss anything in church history. And the reason we do that is that we go, well, we don't believe in tradition, right? Tradition is not authoritative. We abhor the idea that just because somebody did it in church history, some powerful figure in church history did it, that it overcomes the authority of the scriptures. I'm with you. But that's really a pretty terrible way to think about church history. Church history, yes, they're flawed and they made mistakes and many times erred very, very badly. But they are also filled with good, godly men and women who sought to honor God. The people who set the date for December 25th or January 6th, they weren't nefariously trying to integrate all these different pagan ideas. They were seeking to honor God. And we can disagree with some of their thinking, and we can obviously say they've made mistakes. But the fact of the matter is, church history provides a lot of value for us. And none of those is more clear than where we come up with our December 25th Christmas. So, as you're drinking your eggnog and celebrating your Christmas this year on December 25th, just remember, we don't know for sure if that's when Jesus was born. In fact, it's likely the case that he wasn't born then. But the fact of the matter is, we do find a time to celebrate the birth of our Lord, and that is a case for celebration for sure.